Greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and we're here with Writing for Life and Compassionate Christianity. I'm really grateful and excited because we have Nicole Doyley here today, and Nicole is the author of a fabulous new book called What About the Children? And it's about biracial or multiracial families, and the subtitle is Five Values for Multiracial Families. And it's a really excellent book on multiple levels. It's just, I think, going to be a tremendous resource for families navigating what it means to live in a multiracial family, but also for kind of a broader conversation about racial identity and cultural context. So, Nicole, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you.
And maybe you can just start off before we talk about your book, What About the Children? Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of how you got to this place in your journey, including sort of your writing life. So, thanks again and welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor. We were talking offline that it's rainy in both of our locations, so this is a bright spot in a rainy day. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I live in Rochester, New York now. Very different cities. um, and I left Brooklyn and went to Dartmouth College and was an English major. And then I was in full-time ministry for almost 25 years. And then I resigned from at two different churches. I resigned from the second one right before the pandemic to write this book. So I had self-published three other books, and this time I really wanted to climb the steep mountain of traditional publishing. And I knew I needed my best brain and the best hours of the day to do that. I know some authors do it with a full-time job and kids and everything else. And I do have kids, but I just couldn't manage doing it with a full-time job. So yeah. And the project was delayed a little bit because of the pandemic, and all of a sudden I'm homeschooling. like, um, but I did start a podcast during that time called Let's Talk Conversations on Race. And I had originally planned to write a book on race specifically for the church. Um, but, starting in 2020 with all of the racial trauma and upheaval, there were so many books coming out um, that I decided to talk about that, leave that for my podcast and focus specifically on talking about race from a biracial perspective. And it just sort of morphed into being a book for parents raising mixed race kids or transracially adopted kids. Although I have to say, I think it's great for all parents, honestly.
Well, I think that's true. And I was telling you prior to the interview that I'm a former foster parent. So I think also it's relevant to a lot of different kinds of families. And again, is such a important and wonderful resource. So congratulations again on the publication. So tell us a little bit about more about the book. I know it's structured around five values, and also I think it was really compelling to just read sort of the backstory and the introduction in the first couple chapters about your own journey as a biracial kid and in a multiracial family. And sort of just, so tell us about kind of how this book concept was birthed in your own life.
Yeah, well, my father is deceased. He was Black, and my mother is white. And they got married in the early 1960s when it was illegal in half of the country for them to be married. And that was actually one of the reasons why they moved to Brooklyn, because they had met and married in Colorado Springs, and there was it was not it was traumatic for them to be there. So they moved to Brooklyn, and my parents received some advice that was well-meaning, but it wasn't great advice, which was, okay, if we do get married, what about the children, which is the reason for the title? What are their lives going to be like being mixed race? And somebody said to them, as long as they're loved, they'll be fine. And I think the bottom line of my story is that love is not enough, that there has to be intentionality married to love. um, and so, for all of my growing up years into my early 20s, I felt like I had a foot in two different worlds, black world, the white world, and that I didn't really belong in either. And so, sort of being on the outside looking in of life, and sort of not black enough for the black kids, not white enough for the white kids. And my parents really didn't grasp what I was going through, the sort of loneliness and the isolation that I experienced on a daily basis. Um, they provided for us and all, did all the things that parents are supposed to do, but there wasn't really intentionality about you are black and white, and this is what it means to be black, and to teach you to be proud of that, of all that means, your ethnic heritage, your African forefathers, and you are also white, and this is what that means. You have lighter skin, so you're gonna receive privilege that darker people don't have. And um, why is that, and how can you deal with that? So they didn't there wasn't that intentionality. And so you would think, okay, they married in the early 60s and surely by now things are better, but I have come to realize that um, things really aren't better, that parents are still that generation after generation of interracial couples are still sort of thinking, as long as I love my kid, that'll be enough. And biracial people even today feel the same way that I did growing up. um, there's all kinds of studies about how, you know, mixed race kids have to answer more than anybody else, what are you? And in answering that question, or in being faced with a check the box, which race are you? In answering that question, they often feel like, okay, I have to, do I choose one parent? I look more black than white, so do I say I'm black? And, but what about my mom who's white or Asian or whatever? So it's still and there's still the same kind of social isolation that I experienced growing up. So I really wanted to write a um, provide some wisdom, hopefully, for parents, um, that your kids can struggle, or they can be really grounded and really confident, and it's sort of all up to you which one it's going to be, because the same studies say that if mixed race kids are raised to identify with both parents, they could be incredibly confident and have a unique ability to go back and forth between two different worlds. But that's not going to happen by accident. That was long.
No, that was great. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I just have to say, I found it extremely sobering. I think if I read this right, you were 1 years old when the Supreme Court overturned sort of the final laws against interracial marriage. I mean, just the context of how recent this all was.
Yes.
Um, and
Yeah.
also just to say what the sort of the answer, like the highline answer I got from your, opening chapters were sort of what you just said, which is kind of the job of parents is to help a child identify with both parents, identify and understand and love both parts of their cultural heritage or all parts of their cultural and ethnic heritage, and then recognizing that God made them and loved them. So I think that's, a tall order in some ways. Parenting is hard no matter what, but it's, at least you're providing kind of a roadmap. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Um, well, what maybe we can move into, again, you structure the book around 5 values, which again, I thought was very concrete and sort of helpful framework. Maybe we can talk about the first one, awareness. Can you just tell us kind of what you talk about in that section of the book and sort of what advice you have? Thank
Hmm.
you.
Yeah, I mean, I I am a Christian, and I do write it from a Christian perspective, but lots of people who have read my book who are not Christian say this is written from a Christian perspective, but it's great, even if you're not religious at all. And so the part of it that is Christian is that when I sort of talk directly to Christian parents, which is that Christian parents can over spiritualize things, like, as long as my child understands and is grounded in their spiritual identity, that's enough. Meaning they're a child of God. They're redeemed. They have an inheritance in heaven, and who they are spiritually, that God created them and loves them. And that is certainly a really the most important part of our kids' foundation, but they're not spiritual beings floating through life without a body. We all have a body, and our body has a color. And so, in terms of awareness, for parents to realize what that color signifies. So, um, if they are, let's say, black and white, the black side, um, understanding that first of all, there were rich and beautiful empires in Africa before being conquered and colonized by Europe. And so to not start the narrative with, you know, your forefathers came as slaves. No, starting the narrative with your forefathers were part of at the time, the wealthiest, most complex empires on the planet. That Europe can't claim that, actually, Africa can claim that. And so understanding that they come from good stock. And yet, yes, 12 million were taken from Africa and brought over to the Americas. And and the fact that you're here means your forefathers survived. And here's what they survived: the Middle Passage and the slave plantation, and teaching themselves how to read because it was illegal for them to read, and then emancipation, and then what they survived, the 100 years between emancipation and the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So sort of taking pride in all of that, like, you you should not wish away the blackness in you, um, but you should grasp that and love that. And similarly, if a child has an Asian parent and a white parent, this is what Korea is like, was like, and is like, and this is what your grandmother who emigrated and didn't know any English when she got here, and wow, she's just so brave, and so just really grounding them in pride, especially if they're white plus BIPOC, especially in their BIPOC side, because they will learn white culture by default in school and in our culture, but they will not learn their BIPOC culture and learn to take pride in their BIPOC culture in school. Um, so that has to be the most intentional part. And then I'll stop talking in a minute, but understanding something that psychologist Dr. Beverly Tatum talks about, which is cultural racism. So there's obvious racism, racial slurs, and all of that. But cultural racism, Dr. Tatum says, is like smog in the air that we breathe in without even knowing it. So it's the images that we see. It's the things that we watch on Netflix. I tell a story about watching a police series with one of my sons, and about 6 episodes in, I asked him, "So, what color is the bad guy usually?" And he said, "Well, they're usually black or Hispanic." I'm like, "Yep." "And what is their crime usually?" And he's like, "Well, they're usually drug dealers and so on." And I said, "Well, do you know that white people use and sell drugs at the same rate as black people? As a matter of fact, numerically speaking, they use and sell drugs more because there are more of them." And he was like, "Really?" And it just made my heart hurt that he was subconsciously thinking that people who look like him are driving the drug problem in America. So that's an example of cultural racism, just subconsciously the message that was coming into him. And as everybody who watches that police series is, drugs are a black people problem. And similarly, I remember telling to my sons, that there are more poor white people than poor black people in America. And they were like, again, really? I was like, yeah, we're only 12% of the of the population. And then I told them that most poor white people live in rural communities, and so they're more spread out and they're harder to see. And also, there's not a lot of movies that depict white poverty. Most movies show the poor inner city, which is mostly black and brown. So you could come away thinking, well, you know, most Black people are poor, and the ones who aren't poor, well, they're the outliers. In reality, most Black people are not poor. So it's just the images and the messages that we're always getting, which is that, who is the love interest usually in movies? The love interest is usually white or very light skinned. So the messages that we're getting are the closer you are to white, the more beautiful you are. White people are less criminally minded. White people are smarter, more disciplined, that white culture is better. In other words, the message that we're getting is a message of white supremacy. And so all parents need to disrupt that, white or BIPOC, but especially if you have BIPOC children, it would be easy for them to subconsciously believe that their white side is better and to almost wish to be fully white. Um, and so that's where the intentionality and the awareness comes from.
Well, thank you for that. And, it's just so kind of inspiring to hear the ways you're having kind of honest conversations with your own kids and sort of doing education in real time with real life experiences and sort of doing that media
Mhm.
literacy in particular.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe that segues into another value that you talk about in your book, which is honesty.
Mhm.
And my own ethic as a parent is really based on honesty. And so I'd love to hear you talk sort of about how you think about honesty in the context of multiracial families and sort of what that means for you. And again, what advice you have.
Yeah. Well, I talk first about being honest with ourselves. Scripture talks about God says, I want truth in your inward parts. So it's like being willing to look in a mirror and being honest with yourself. So, for example, there are uh, people who have immigrated here from other countries, and perhaps they were leaving a war-torn country. So, for example, I have a friend who's Korean and white, and her mother is Korean, and her mother left Korea just during the Korean War, and it was just terrible. And when her mother came to America, she was so happy to be in America. And two things were true. Number one, she received a lot of racism because her mother came not knowing how to speak English. And then when she learned how to speak English, it was very accented English. So her mother experienced a lot of racism. And also the Korea she left, she was just glad to leave and wanted to leave it behind. So what that meant was when she was raising her daughter, my friend, was she was basically instilling in her daughter, be as white as possible. I'm not going to teach you the language. Um, I, I'm not going to teach you the culture because I want you to assimilate into American culture. And for a lot of people, what that means is white American culture. Um, and so she grew up, and she looks more Korean than white. So she grew up, still experienced racism because she, grew up in a small, mostly white town. Um, so she grew up experiencing racism and just wishing that she didn't have these, Asian eyes, and that she didn't look the way she looked. And, Asian is bad, Korean is bad. Um, so, so being honest with yourself, like if you've left a situation, especially for immigrants or second generation, um, if you are still harboring sort of trauma from that, it will be impossible to instill in your kids pride in that. And so allowing yourselves to be healed of that, and recognizing like, okay, I have this child who has Korean heritage or Asian heritage or Hispanic heritage, and they need to be proud of that because that's part of who they are. Um, and and also for the honesty in terms of why with yourself, the honesty with yourself in terms of why you married the person that you did. So, especially more in the past, but still sometimes now, there are Black men who marry white women because sort of trying to escape and evade being Black and trying to have lighter skinned children because they rightly recognize that lighter skinned people have it easier. So did you marry, or for white women marrying Black men, okay, were you just rebelling against your racist parents? Were you rebelling against this small town insular community that you grew up in and you're just trying to try something different? So being honest with the motivation for marrying this person, because if unfortunately I've met a good number of white women who have had Black partners and they now have biracial kids and they're no longer together with their Black partner and they harbor racism but they have this biracial child. So because they grew up in a small town, because they grew up with racist parents and they never interrogated that, they never disrupted that, they they got pregnant because of a fling or they fell in love, temporarily fell in love, but they have not done the work to uproot that racism that's in themselves. So anyway, it's being honest with themselves, and then it's being honest with your kids. Like you you are white and Black, and because you look more Black than white, you will likely experience racism, and this is how you handle that. And teaching kids this from an early age, when they're little, it could be in little kid terms, like, there might be somebody who doesn't like you because you have brown skin, and it's just so silly and wrong. And, you have brown skin because, my forefathers came from Nigeria, and, this is who they were, and that, your brown skin is beautiful, but, somebody might not like you because of your brown skin. And that is not because there's something wrong with having brown skin. There's something wrong with them, not something wrong with you. So it's being honest with yourself. How was I raised? Do I harbor racist attitudes and thoughts? And I would say that in America, it's almost impossible not to um, have racism even tucked away in the dark crevices of our soul. Um, and most people don't have to look at that and deal with that. But if you have BIPOC kids, you have to look at it and deal with it.
Well, thank you for that. And you said at one point, like doing the work, and I'm reminded sort of as I'm listening to you that it's just not a one and done. I think some
Right.
people think, oh, well, I kind of dealt with all that when I was in my 20s and I,
Mhm.
learned a lot and did a lot of reading or whatever. And now it's like, oh no, this is a daily journey. This is a weekly journey. Like this has to be work we do all the time, unfortunately. But I think
Yeah.
it's a reality.
Could I add
So
to that? Oh, sorry.
yeah. No, go ahead.
No, yeah, because another thing that you're being honest with yourself about and being honest with your kids about is, so right now in America, white people have 10 times, the average white family has 10 times more wealth than the average Black family. That's just a fact. So you could look at that. And so, most beautiful suburbs with beautiful green lawns are mostly white. And most Black people are in the middle class, but still not having the means to move into those mostly white upper middle class suburbs. So being honest and looking at that and like, okay, why is that? Is that because, white people really do work harder and make better choices, and, and, Black people just have all these problems? Or is it because because Black people were systematically shut out from opportunities, and that still has ripple effects to today? So, in other words, is white supremacy true or is systemic racism true? And to decide, which one do I believe? And then, because whichever one you believe, that's what you're going to teach your children, either overtly or covertly. Um, But if you do the work and find out, okay, why are there so few Black families in this upper middle class suburb um, across America, and then teach that to your kids, because they're going to see the disparity. They're going to drive through a rough part of town, which is mostly Black and brown, and then they're going to drive through the beautiful bucolic suburbs, which is mostly white. They will see that. So to be intentional about teaching them why that is.
Thank you so much for that, because I just think you're so right. The sort of conversation about economics and wealth is just a really critical part of this conversation, and very difficult and sort of painful, but I think really important. So thank you. Well, maybe we can shift gears a little for a minute now and talk a little bit about kind of your writing journey and your publication journey. And you said at the beginning in your opening remarks that you had self-published several books and really wanted to grapple with, or I don't know, I forget the word you used, but sort of attempt the traditional publishing path, which can be, of course, an uphill climb and also full of challenges, both
Mhm.
known and unknown at the outset. So,
Yeah.
do you have any kind of takeaways or insights from this journey, or in particular, any advice you have for sort of aspiring writers or writers who are hoping to make that shift into traditional publishing? Any words
Mhm.
of caution? Thank
Well, I'm going to be super honest here. So, like I said, I self-published 3 books, then traditionally published this one, and I could say that there's no comparison. You know, I watched a lot of seminars and stuff, and the bottom line of those seminars was that they were sort of equally good. And well, first of all, I want to say, if you have self-published, kudos to you. You sat down, you wrote a book, you finished a book, you've sold however many copies, your story is out there. That is worthy of celebration. However, the time and attention that the editors at Westminster, John Knox, and I'm sure at all publishing companies, the time that they've taken with my book to take it from being good to being excellent. The amount of times that my editor read it, there was the first initial go through and high level comments, and then more picky, and then the copy editor. These are professional eyes. When I self published, 2 of them I just had friends read, and one of them I hired an editor, just one editor. And like I said, there's no comparison in terms of the quality, in terms of having so many eyes. It's actually humbling how many people at that company read my book. The editor, the copy editor, the marketing person, they've all read my book. And they all have degrees in these, they all have expertise in their area. Um, so of course you self-publish and you think, yeah, I did a good job, or else you wouldn't try to publish it in the first place. But like I said, the traditional publishing it really is a professional, um, it's a professional thing. And they don't want to make any mistakes in terms of citing, they don't want to get sued because they failed to cite something properly, and they want the book to sell, and they are experts in figuring out how to make that happen. So I think that it is worth the uphill climb, if that's possible, um, depending on your season of life, because it does take so much more work, than self-publishing. So sometimes it's just not possible. You're working full time, you have little kids or whatever, and you just can't, it's not possible. But if it's possible to start that climb, I encourage writers to do it. It just takes a long time to find an agent, and then it takes a long time for that agent to find a publisher. I don't have hundreds of thousands of followers. But I did the best that I could in increasing my platform, and then just jumped in the deep end and hoped and prayed. Um, So I think that the whole platform building might become something that changes because I might be wrong, but I think more and more Americans are leaving social media, um, because we see what it's doing to us. Um, and so to have 100,000 followers on social media is gonna become harder than it is. Um, but, that's not the case yet. So, the platform building is certainly a bear. Um, and then the finding the agent and finding and he or she finding the publisher is another bear. I read a statistic that 98% of book proposals don't go anywhere, so it's like 2%. So to have the kind of I had a tiny bit of audacity that I could be among the 2% and a lot of self-doubt, um, and that self-doubt made it hard to sit at my desk every day and either pump out another chapter or reconfigure my book proposal or send more pitches to agents. That self-doubt made it really hard to do that. But I had my husband and friends saying, "You could do this. You've got this. The world needs this book." So, yeah, I don't think you could do it without having cheerleaders cheering you on, sort of like the marathon, the Boston Marathon or whatever. There's all these people on the sidelines clapping. I think writers need that because it is a marathon.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I think it's also a marathon after the book is published too. You need to continue to have cheerleaders because I think that in some ways is the loneliest part, is when sort of the book is out there and those cheerleaders may be reading your book, but you don't always get that feedback. They're not right on the sidelines.
Yes.
But thank you so much for also naming. I've said that to others as well too. That one of the biggest blessings I think of working with a traditional publisher is the developmental editor. So there's
Mhm.
the copyright, as you mentioned, but the developmental editor who's really saying, how can you make this better? How can we rework this? And that is just such a gift, as you beautifully stated. Um, well, your book is, speaking of beautiful, your book is gorgeous and your writing is beautiful and compelling and sharp and insightful. So your book is a gift to the world. So thank you so much. And I'm glad you persevered, um, despite some of the self-doubt that we all feel.
Mhm. Thank you.
Well, maybe let's shift back to, again, sort of the content of your book and sort of how you're hoping it will land, given sort of the current state of the world, which is so scary and awful and divisive. And, we're seeing this huge backlash against diversity, equity, inclusion. I mean, backlash is almost a sort of not strong enough word, I think. And I know, of course, your book is intended to speak directly to the heart of multiracial families and to parents specifically and about child rearing, um, primarily. But, can you just talk a little bit about sort of how you see your book kind of fitting into the larger
Mhm.
reality that we're all living in, and sort of the arc of what's happened over the past 5 or 6 years is just, I think, so
Mhm.
dramatic in this country. And yeah, so just how do you see your book fitting into that bigger landscape? Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, first I wanna say that I you know, humility aside or whatever, I do think this book is incredibly relevant even to white families or monoracial families. But let's think about specifically right now white families. Um, so for a white parent to realize that they are raising children sort of swimming in a stream of white supremacy, that from a young age, children are getting the same messages that I talked about with the police show and, they go to school and 82% of their teachers are white. They go to the pediatrician and the pediatrician is likely white. Um, that they perceive in their little souls that they perceive the racial hierarchy, and they perceive in their little souls that in America it is better to be white. And so for parents to realize that this is the message that their white children are receiving. And if they don't want their white children to just perpetuate we always say, oh man, it's 2025. I can't believe, this just happened in terms of a racist incident. Well, it's because parents don't disrupt this. It just keeps getting passed down from generation to generation. And so yes, for white parents to be aware that this is the message their kids are getting. One of the stories I tell is when one of my sons was 3, he went to his first birthday party, and he was the only Black. It was his preschool class, which was all white except him. And they sat around us in a circle to play duck, duck, goose. And all of the white children went around tapping heads and passed over my son's head. So there was duck, 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 duck. And so all of the white kids got to be goose and chase the kid around and slide into the spot, except my son. And so these are a bunch of 3-year-olds. So I don't think any of these white parents sat their child down and said, now there's going to be a Black boy there and I don't want you to touch his head. None of the parents said that. But these kids subconsciously themselves saw, of course they saw. They're not, unless they're physically colorblind, they could see that he looks different. And they all subconsciously chose to avoid touching different. And so what should have happened at that birthday party was, after 1 or 2 white kids didn't touch my son's head, maybe the birthday girl's mom pull her aside and say, make sure that you get, that this brown boy gets to be goose. Make sure, touch his head and make sure he's included in the fun and not just invited to the fun. So for white parents to be like, yes, you will, unless you do intentional things, your children are receiving racist messages that they will then pass on to their children unless you interrupt it. And then in terms of what's going on in our culture in this country, I think for all parents, BIPOC parents should have never trusted schools to teach their kids what they need to know, but even more so now, when schools are getting rid of books about Rosa Parks and Ruby Bridges and Jackie Robinson. That idea that we could send our kids to school and they learn what they need to learn, and then we're free to, you know, not deal with that. It's just a false premise. They are not learning what they need to learn in order to have a healthy racial identity. And in order for white kids to not be inculcating white supremacist messages. So as parents, we have to buy the books and take them to the library and watch the YouTubes that explain things, and making sure that our friends and our world and our social circle is not all white, but making sure that they're full of people of color, and our children see us honoring and appreciating different kinds of people, buying different colored dolls and action figures, buying picture books with all kinds of kids in them. Um, yeah, we could, you know, trust the schools to teach basic reading and math and science and all of that. But the schools have never and will never be enough, especially now, to teach them how to have a healthy identity in terms of not feeling inferior and not feeling superior.
Well, what a powerful call to action. And I wasn't planning on asking this, but maybe, I mean, when I'm listening to you, I'm like, you're so right, you're so right, you're so right. And also recognizing my own, as a parent, fallibility and, failures and also fatigue. Parenting is so hard and can feel so lonely no matter what. So maybe we can also, do you have any sort of words of encouragement for parents if they're feeling like they're not doing enough, or maybe missed the boat or missed an opportunity? What I mean, I think for myself, what I'm thinking is, well, there's always tomorrow, there's always the next day.
Right.
And also that we have to be in community around this, that we can't, yes, maybe the schools are going to be inadequate, but we have our other, our friends and our play groups and our, parents that we've, excuse me, raised our children with. So I'm just kind of brainstorming myself, but do you have any thoughts on that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think so. America is still largely segregated. I touched on that before in terms of city and suburbs, um, which affects school districts, which affects churches, and other social or communal gatherings. Um, and so, and also statistically, 75% of white people will never have a friend of color. And statistically, most white people don't feel like there's anything missing in their lives if they don't have a friend of color. And so to humbly recognize, yeah, there is something missing from your life. Um, one of my closest friends is Nigerian. Her name is Blessing. And we have kids the same age, and we've raised our kids, um, we've gone from babies to toddlers to teenagers to college prep. And I don't know who I'd be as a parent if I didn't have Blessing in my life, in terms of having coffee with her, having lunch with her. How did you deal with cell phones? How did you deal with this? How did you with this? And because I don't like totally the American way of parenting. Um, I mean, it's not all bad, but there's a lot of it that I don't like. And so having this African immigrant in my life, as well as my husband is a Jamaican immigrant, so he's even closer in my life. But having people from different cultural perspectives in my life, observing their parenting and saying, I like that. I want that. I want my kids to be like that. So anyway, that's cross-cultural more than cross-racial, but I think there's a humility that white parents need to have, is like, there is something missing from my life if 100% of my friends are white Americans. I am missing out. It's sort of like if all you ever eat is pasta, and there's a whole range of other foods out there and different tastes, and they're delicious and different seasonings, that you're missing out on. So yeah, and for Christians to realize, from the early church on, God has set forth his ideal for the church, which is multiracial and multicultural.
Mm,
So there's something missing from your life if you have a homogeneous life.
mm, amen to that. Well, and you said something, I think, right in the first couple minutes of this conversation. You used the word intentionality, and I think that that's sort of one of the main things I'm getting is all of this requires intentionality and and perhaps prayerful intentionality. So, well, Nicole, thank you so much. Your leadership, kind of your insights are so timely and helpful and compelling. So tell us where we can find you online, how we can connect with you, how we can buy your book, how we can find your podcast, and if there's anything else you want to say before we wrap up.
Yeah, so my website is NicoleDoyley.com, and you can see how to spell doily on your screen. So NicoleDoyley.com. And there's information about where to find my book on there, but it's really available everywhere. Barnes and Noble, Amazon, from the publisher Westminster John Knox, uh, so wherever books are sold. My podcast is pretty much on all podcast platforms. Let's Talk Conversations on Race. Um, and no, I'm hoping to help parents to, I said a lot of weighty things, but to really, your kids are beautiful and wonderful, and we're the sort of molding and shaping them, and that's an awesome responsibility, but it's also a wonderful responsibility. And so just sort of hoping to help bring some wisdom to that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Again, I encourage everyone to check out your book, What About the Children? 5 Values for Multiracial Families. And as you said, I think while this is intended primarily for parents and parents of biracial or multiracial kids, I think it really speaks to anyone and everyone. So, congratulations on the launch, and please stay in touch and let us know kind of how it goes with the book kind of making its way out into the world.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. It's lovely to be here with you.
Yeah. Thank you. Blessings and thanks again.